There's a popular argument against an objective morality that goes as follows. People who believe in an objective morality are dogmatic, authoritarian, and intolerant. After all, it seems to follow from the belief that something is immoral or wrong that you not only can, but must impose that standard of behavior on anybody. People who violate an objective morality must be stopped. Subjectivism, on the other hand, promotes tolerance. Once you realize that moral right and wrong is merely a matter of preference, you see that no morality is better than any other. And this implies tolerance of other positions. After all, neither view is right in any absolute objective sense. In fact, this is bad reasoning, as Bernard Williams describes in his brief interlude on relativism in his book Morality: An Introduction to Ethics. The thesis that we'll be looking at is the thesis that the belief that morality is subjective promotes tolerance, and the belief that morality is objective implies dogmatic intolerance. The position begins with the premise, no culture is better than another. This seems to undercut any type of dogmatic intolerance of other cultures. Dogmatic intolerance seems to require the belief, my culture is correct and superior, your culture is incorrect and inferior. The problem is that the conclusion that some people draw from this premise is the tolerant culture is superior to the intolerant culture. Furthermore, the defender of tolerance appears quite willing to impose their views concerning tolerance on others. And that's a problem. In order to understand the problem better, I want to construct the strongest argument that I can for the thesis that cultural moral relativism implies a duty to be tolerant of other cultures. This requires that we begin with an understanding of cultural moral relativism. Cultural moral relativism holds that acts performed within a culture are to be judged according to whether they conform to or violate that culture's moral standards. An excellent example of cultural relativism involves language. The meanings of terms, how to spell, the rules of grammar are all determined by one's culture. Within a culture, a particular person's use of a term or the way they spell a term or their grammar can be counted as wrong if it violates a language culture's rules. But a language culture cannot be mistaken about its rules. So, back to cultural moral relativism. A culture comes up with a set of rules on how to dress, what to eat, what to wear, who to marry, how to raise one's children, on practices such as promise-keeping or property ownership, on the correct treatment of others, just as it comes up with a set of rules on how to spell or pronounce different words and the meanings of those words. Those rules can change over time, just as they do with language. A person's actions can be wrong if the person acts in ways prohibited by the set of cultural norms. But a culture cannot be wrong in its choices regarding what those norms are. In the case of language, we hold it to be a mistake to claim that another culture's language practices are correct or incorrect. It would make no sense for somebody speaking English to say that the English word for something is correct and the French word is incorrect. Among English speakers, the English word is correct, and among French speakers, the French word is correct. By analogy, in the case of morality, according to cultural moral relativism, it would make no sense for somebody in England following the norms of England to say that the norms of France are mistaken. In English, the English norms are correct, and in France, the French norms are correct. So how would a defender of cultural moral relativism see the act of using one's own cultural norms to criticize another culture? They would see that person as making the false assumption that its culture's values are objectively correct and that their culture has figured out some sort of cosmic moral truth that other cultures haven't figured out yet. However, there is no goodness that transcends cultures, just as there's no language that transcends cultures. There are only the norms and practices adopted by each culture for its own use. So this provides an argument that cultural moral relativism implies that it's a mistake for people of one culture to judge morally the people of another culture, acting in accordance with that culture's norms. This would be like the people of one language culture condemning the members of another language culture for using different words. Unfortunately, this analogy doesn't work. the person presenting this principle of tolerance is presenting it as a value that is objectively correct. They're asserting that tolerance represents some sort of cosmic moral truth, something that those who are intolerant hasn't figured out yet. If there are no principles that are above and independent of culture, on the basis of which cultures can be assessed, then tolerance cannot be a principle that is above and independent of culture, on the basis of which cultures can be assessed. Here's how Bernard Williams puts it. Quote, "If we're going to say that there are ultimate moral disagreements between societies, we must include in the matters they can disagree about their attitudes to other moral outlooks." End quote. Here's another way of making the same point. If we must be tolerant of other cultures, then what should we say about the following cultures? The Roman Empire, with its practice of conquering neighboring people and subjecting them to Roman rule. The Crusade culture of the 11th through 13th century in Europe. The Mongol Empire, with its widespread conquest from China to the Middle East to Central Europe. The conquistador culture of Spain in the 16th and 17th centuries, with the conquering and forced conversion of the Native Americans. The Confederacy of the United States, with its slave culture. The Empire of Great Britain, with its conquest and attempts to civilize lands from India to Australia. The former Soviet Union's attempt to establish a global communist hegemony. Do we judge them as bad cultures? If we do, then this seems to deny the thesis that we not judge other cultures. If we don't condemn these cultures, then our claim that cultures ought to be tolerant appears empty. Another problem that Williams brings up for cultural moral relativism is that of telling us what a culture is. Williams says, quote, "Apart from its logically unhappy attachment of a non-relative morality of toleration or non-interference to a view of morality as relative, the theory suffers in its functionalist aspects, notably difficulties that surround the identification of a society." End quote. If one's culture determines whether one's actions are right or wrong, how is a devout Catholic, for example, living in Colorado to determine if abortion is murder or not? Abortion is permitted in Colorado, at least as of this writing. Does the Catholic Church or the state in which one resides determine the permissibility or impermissibility of one's actions? Many of us belong to multiple cultures that give sometimes conflicting answers to a bunch of moral questions. This ties into another question. Under cultural moral relativism, how are we to understand reform? Let us assume, for the sake of argument, that cultural moral relativism is true, that one's culture determines what is right and wrong. Assume that one lives in a slave culture, but one judges slavery to be wrong. If one lives in a slave culture, and if one's culture determines what's right and wrong, one would be forced to the conclusion that slavery is permissible. Anybody who condemns slavery in a culture that says that slavery is acceptable must be mistaken. So we have to give up one of these two propositions. Either no culture is better than any other is false, or the tolerant culture is better than the intolerant culture is false. The inability to define culture and the problem that reform makes no sense if cultural moral relativism is true provides reasons to give up the first of these propositions. Interestingly, the thesis that there are moral facts is in a better position to defend the thesis that one of these moral facts is that one should be tolerant of other cultures. All of the problems with intolerance, all of the evils listed above from the Roman conquest to the present, are evils that argue for a greater tolerance of differences of opinion. After all, the premise that there are moral facts does not justify the arrogant presumption that one has discovered those moral facts and that it's others who have different beliefs who are the ones who are mistaken. This at least puts us in a position where we can debate the merits of toleration without the threat of contradiction. And this is a topic genuinely worthy of debate. Toleration may be an objectively good thing and something that moral cultures should adopt. But that's a discussion for another video.